For this lesson, the first thing we need to recap is where functions happen in unicellular, colonial, and multicellular organisms, what level they occur at. So for a unicellular organism, you might be looking at something like an amoeba or fried egg, as it looks like here. That organism, all the functions are going to be going on in that organism at the cellular level. There's no question about that because all that organism is one cell. So you might have the mitochondria in that cell performing their function. You've got the cell membrane allowing things to come in and out. You've got, the Golgi body, endoplasmic reticulum moving things around. All that's occurring at the cellular level. So that's pretty straightforward. The colonial situation is similar to that, but instead of having just one cell, obviously you'll remember that we've got a whole bunch of cells working together now. And the cells around the outside of this little colony might all be spinning their little flagella in order to allow that colony to move. And you might have some internal cells that are slightly, or organisms that are slightly specialised to do digestion or reproduction or something like that. But each of those functions, digestion, movement, etc., are all still happening on a cellular level here. So even though these organisms are all cooperating with each other and they're all advantaged by that cooperation, the functions themselves are still happening on a cellular level. So that's colonial organisms. Now, multicellular organisms become very different to that very quickly. So obviously, we're made up of cells. So this sort of stuff is still happening on a cellular level. We can't move our whole body using just one cell, but cells do still perform metabolism and a lot of important things. But a lot of our life processes are happening on a much bigger level than that. So for example, if we want to move, then we've got to engage tissues called muscle tissue in order to do that. So some of our functions are going to happen at a tissue level, but often those tissues will be combining into organs like the heart in order to do functions like pumping blood around the body. And of course, the heart is part of a bigger system that is the cardiovascular system or circulatory system that is also contributing or performing that function on a bigger picture level. So for multicellular organisms, we've got things that tend to happen at these higher levels of organisation. And our cells are different cells combined together to form different types of tissues. So our muscle tissues are all made up of muscle cells, and they might be smooth muscle cells, for example. Those tissues are then organised into organs, like your heart, like your kidney, like your skin even, and then those organs are organised into systems. So our bodies are functioning through all these different levels, but particularly up here for multicellular organisms. Okay, so that leads to the question then of, well, how do we build all these things? How do we get from the cell that we started at up to a whole organism, which is really the final level of organisation that we've got here? There are lower levels of organisation. There's molecules and organelles and things like that that are down at a lower level than cells, and there's higher levels of organisation than the organism. So organisms can be grouped together into populations of a particular species, or they can be part of ecosystems. But for now, we're just looking at these levels of organisation. And the question is, how does a cell become a whole organism? Okay? So we know that every multicellular sexually reproducing organism is going to start with something like this, where we've got gametes, the sperm and the egg. They've each got their own collection of DNA in them, and they're going to come together and they're going to use mostly the egg and some DNA, bits and pieces from the sperm, to form what we call a zygote. So this very first cell in a new individual, which is formed by the process of fertilization, this first cell is called a zygote. Okay? Now, how do we get from this zygote to an organism as complex as you are? And obviously, there's a lot in between this and this. So to start with, we can say, well, the zygote could just undergo a process called mitosis to divide once, and then once again, and then once again, and so on. And definitely it's going to do that. That's going to be the first step in this process, is just mitosis. And eventually it's going to form a ball of cells, or a sort of, a sphere, a hollow sphere of cells, okay? That hollow sphere of cells is called a blastocyst, okay? And it's going to undergo various processes. The ends of it are going to indent, and eventually there's going to form a little sort of hollow tube down the middle of that sphere, and this is going to become the digestive tract of the organism eventually. But the problem that we've got with that is, if the only process that's happening is mitosis, then every single cell in the blastocyst and then in the forming embryo, we can imagine this sort of slowly becoming something that looks a little bit more like a baby, and then, eventually we go through the whole growth and development and birth, and we end up outside the womb and growing into a full individual. But if that's all happening with completely identical cells, then our body's just not going to work. We're not going to have our different organs. We're not going to have our different tissues that we need. So, what do we do? What has to happen is these original cells have to undergo a process that we call differentiation. That's 2 F's. Differentiation. And that differentiation turns them from a very generic cell that's able to do all the usual cellular processes into a more specialized cell. So that might be a long, thin muscle cell, or it might be a weird shaped kind of neuron, part of our nervous system, or, it might just be a skin cell or epithelial cell. So this process we refer to as differentiation, and these cells, we would say, these are specialized cells. And the original cells, you might be familiar with the idea of stem cells. So they're the cells in our body that haven't undergone this process of differentiation yet, so they're not yet specialized. And there's a couple of different types of stem cells that you'll learn about in your reading today, but they're like the original cells, and they have to undergo this process in order to become the cells that all our bodies need. And they'll do that, they'll migrate to different places within these growing structures. And as they migrate to those different places within the growing structures, they'll undergo these processes of specialisation. So once that's happened, there's obviously a lot more to this story, and this is really fascinating process, really interesting, and there's still a lot of work being done in the field of embryology to work out how this occurs. But once they've undergone all those processes, then we've got a fully functioning multicellular organism that can operate to do its functions on all these different levels that we talked about to begin with. Okay, so now that I've gone through that with you, you can go ahead and do today's work.